The first cut on this record has been cross-format focused for airplay success.
The men beat on their drums.
Hello and welcome to Politics Theory Other, a podcast from Tribune Magazine. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Alexander Gallas. We spoke about the degree of popular support for the political and economic project of the Thatcher government, the debates between Stuart Hall and Bob Jessop on the extent of Thatcherite hegemony, and we also chatted about the way in which the New Labour era can be seen as a consolidation of Thatcherite neoliberalism. Today's show is brought to you by PTO supporters on Patreon and also by Verso Books, which has loads of brilliant left-wing titles that might be of interest to PTO listeners. One that you might like to check out is Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family by Sophie Lewis. A landmark text of visionary feminist thinking, the book's been described by Donna Haraway as the seriously radical cry for full gestational justice that I long for. And in fact, you can check out an interview I did with Sophie about the book. Just look for episode 35 in whichever podcast app you're using. And you can find out more about Full Surrogacy Now at versobooks.com. You can listen to PTO on iTunes, Acast, SoundCloud, Blueberry and Spotify. And you can also follow the show on Facebook and Twitter. The handle, as always, is @PolTheoryOther. And if you enjoy the show, please do consider rating or reviewing it on iTunes. It makes a big difference in helping the show to reach new listeners. And if you would like to, you can also support the show by donating through Patreon. The show really needs listener support if it's to be viable in the long run. And you can become a supporter for as little as $3 a month, which is just over £2. And by becoming a patron, you'll get access to extended versions of PTO episodes, including today's interview. You can find the Patreon page at patreon.com/poletheoryother. Alexander Gallas is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Kassel in Germany and one of the editors of the Global Labour Journal. He has a PhD and an MA in sociology and is the author of The Thatcherite Offensive, a Neo-Poulantzasian Analysis, published in the UK by Haymarket Books. You begin the book by contrasting the positions of two groups of Marxist intellectuals in the 1980s who were seeking to account for the success of the Thatcher project or just more broadly describe what the Thatcher project was. So there's the first group most closely associated with Stuart Hall and the cultural studies tradition, and then the second group around Bob Jessop and the state theory school. So as I understand it, the nature of the dispute between the two groups was over the degree to which Thatcherism could be seen as a successful hegemonic project. Could you explain what is meant by a hegemonic project and what you see as the key differences between the positions taken by the groups around Hall and around Jessop?
I think the group around Hall came first, and the point they were making was that they said, well, this is not just a sort of authoritarian crackdown. In actual fact, Thatcherism manages to organize quite a lot of consent, and quite a lot of people are in support of it. And the issue they were thinking about was how does that work, and why is it that people suddenly agree to a project that radically changes the parameters of British politics towards the right, and possibly even working class people start supporting such an agenda.
And so this is in response to a degree of resistance to seeing Thatcherism as a project which had significant popular support.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, the assumption that, this is just a reflection of a situation of crisis, this will blow over, this will go away, And Hall and the other authors in his camp actually stressed, no, there's something at stake. There is possibly a fundamental shift going on, and the parameters of politics will be changed quite profoundly. And the way the Thatcherites, or the circle around Thatcher, do it is that they say, and that is possibly a story that resonates with politics today, they go against the establishment just as they go against the people on the left who are trying to bring down the country. So in a certain way, the claim was, according to Hall and his circle, that there was a mode of speaking on behalf of the people against established forces that brought the country into a crisis. And these forces were on the left, on the right, and they also went across classes. I mean, that's part of this sort of populist appeal of Thatcherism, that, the claim was, one nation Tories were too willing to compromise. They didn't take a hard line where they should have taken a hard line. Very often behind them were vested interests that weren't really interested in productive investment, but in simply enjoying their privileges. So in a certain way, the point Hall and his circle made was that there was something like a new group emerging that centered on this idea that the hardworking, aspiring people in Britain deserved something better than this system that had gone into crisis. And they were able to build a lot of consent around this. And I think, or my point then was to say, well, this is a valid analysis and an important analysis, but possibly not a complete analysis of what went on. So the Jessop side very much stressed, well, yes, this may be the case, but there are all sorts of contradictions, especially at the economic level and the political level, that are important to take into account when you look at Thatcherism. Possibly they're not able to resolve the fundamental economic problems that became visible in the 1970s crisis, and also possibly the consent that they managed to organize is not from all quarters of British society, but from certain groups. And so my thinking when I reread this debate was that actually these positions are not mutually exclusive. They were discussed as mutually exclusive positions back then. In a certain way, there was a debate between the two sides, and it was going back and forth. One side said, you have to take this into account, and the other side said, well, but that was not our point, and so forth. And I thought you can bring this together. And that brings me back to your initial question about the hegemonic project. Well, for the people around Hall, hegemony refers to the ability of groups representing the ruling classes to produce consent and to present their ideas as ideas that are commonly shared. The people around Jessop then took up this line of thinking but said, well, it's a correct observation that this sort of mode of governing through hegemony, through being able to present very particular and specific ideas aligned to specific interests as ideas that represent the common good, that we link those to broader political projects and see how they actually work in terms of mobilizing this consent, and where they mobilize this consent and how they're aligned to certain strategies in economic policy in particular. And I then made the point that maybe the question isn't so much whether, which was a big question back then, is whether Thatcherism was hegemonic or not, whether it had huge public support or it didn't have huge public support, but which type of support it took. And so I came building on some of the concepts Bob Jessop introduced to the debate, came up with this idea that you could distinguish between one nation and two nations hegemonic projects. The first one being more expansive and including more parts of the population, and the second one building more on division and just targeting certain parts and attacking other parts. And then the point was to say that Thatcherism was a project of the latter type, or was aligned to a project of the latter type.
And what would an historical example be of a one-nation hegemonic project?
Essentially, I guess you could say that all the attempts made in post-war years to build a post-war settlement that is built on the idea that you have full employment in a welfare state, but also a certain degree of acquiescence from the trade unions and organized labor to the capitalist status quo, that these were projects that possibly at least strategically aimed for something like that. Whether it came into existence is a different question, because historically speaking, from what I found, this post-war arrangement very, very, very quickly ran into problems and recurring economic crises, and the various post-war governments of Britain, be they Labour or Conservative, struggled with establishing a kind of stable form of government that at the same time ensured a steady growth in living standards for the working class. So from the late 50s onwards, this became more and more of a problem and culminated in the 70s crisis. So in that sense, you could argue possibly a lot of the ideas at the time were framed in a one-nation way, but possibly never had a project that really took off and enjoyed very, very broad success and very broad support.
And would you perhaps see some of the governments in mainland Europe, I mean, particularly perhaps West Germany during the period of the 50s, 60s and the 70s as a successful hegemonic project as compared to a failed attempt at a one-nation hegemonic project in the UK?
I mean, it was surely less ridden by crises, what you saw in some of the Western European countries. I'm a bit hesitant to apply the exact same term, because it very much is a term that obviously comes from British politics. This notion of a one-nation Toryism, which goes back to the 19th century. But, I mean, you could say that West Germany, say, in the 50s and 60s, was a country where you had fairly broad support and rising living standards. Nevertheless, it's also important to point out that this consent is never complete. And I guess that's a very important part of the West German story, that there was a migrant population that was part of this story and part of the effort to rebuild West Germany after the war that was not part of this consensus.
This is the guest worker program.
Yeah. And did not benefit materially to the same degree that other members of the German working class benefited from it. So these things need to be taken into account. But in terms of, I guess, the overall thrust of politics, yes, it was very much a mode of politics where you had a broad degree of consent to the prevailing economic system, to the degree that you had in the late 60s already something that has become more prevalent in recent years in German politics, which is a so-called grand coalition between the Christian Democratic and the Social Democratic Party governing together, which is obviously a very, very much a consensus-based political model, but at the same time from the 60s and 70s, late 60s, early 70s onwards, also first signs of economic strains. I mean, that is also part of the story in West Germany.
In terms of thinking about Thatcherism as a two-nation hegemonic project, what does that exactly look like? Who are the two nations?
Well, I mean, it's an age-old distinction in British politics. It goes back centuries. that there's this idea that they're the deserving and the undeserving poor. So a group of people who are poor because they're work shy in this discourse, they are not willing to work, who are immoral and so forth, and then a group who, due to circumstances, they don't control land in a bad situation and deserve some help. So this is a really old pattern, if you will. But I would say, and I would argue, that there is a specific Thatcherite twist on this motive, or a way in which this was taken up from the 70s onwards, by saying, well, there are actually two nations here. One nation of people who are idle, who are lazy, who don't want to work hard, who either enjoy privileges or make trouble, who complain, and then another group who are sort of hardworking, who want to better themselves, who want to improve their situation. And you can find these motives in a lot of the speeches, papers, pronouncements of the circle around Thatcher, and from Thatcher herself in the 70s and then also in the 80s. And building on that, I would say the general way in which Thatcher and her circle communicated with the population was to say, well, obviously we side with those who are sort of hardworking, who are aspiring, who want to better themselves, and we go against those who are idle and privileged.
And privilege here includes unionized workers, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that can be a unionized worker who likes to go on strike and doesn't really work and doesn't really do much apart from complaining. But that can also be someone who works in the city as part of aristocratic networks, enjoys long lunches, doesn't work much, and pockets money through trading shares in the stock exchange, which is like a gentleman's club that no one can enter. So both these groups were attacked in Thatcherite discourses, and they were saying, we go against them. These are the vested interests. And any kind of people who were somehow not conforming to what the Thatcherites saw as this large group of people who are hardworking and who want to improve themselves through hard work and so forth. And when it came to the actual political agenda that came out of this meant crucially attacking the trade unions. My book is very much about saying that a crucial part of the Thatcherite project, if not the crucial part, was undermining organized labor in Britain. But part of it was also, and that's also a chapter in my book, about, for example, liberalizing the stock exchange and making sure financial corporations had access to it and international financial corporations had access to it, and these kind of old networks that controlled it were sidelined in the process.
And so in terms of that attack on gentlemanly capitalism, so to speak, and the so-called wets in the political sphere around Thatcher that were identified with One Nation Toryism, is that simply done because it's a useful strategy in making that populist turn appealing to the working class by saying, look, we're going after these vested interests at the top. We're not just going after, feckless workers, quote unquote. Or is that attack on that sector of the elite actually a goal in and of itself?
My hunch is it's the latter. There seemed to be a strong sense in Thatcherite circles, and I think here of Keith Jessop, who was one of the leading intellectuals behind the Thatcherite project, who wrote about how the transition to capitalism in Britain had been incomplete, and how this had created certain vested interests that were privileged simply because of feudal privileges. Now, obviously, this didn't go as far as saying, we want to go against, say, the royal family or abolish these aspects of British society and the British political system. But there seemed to be a strong sense that they wanted a new type or more complete type of capitalism, which they also called a popular capitalism, meaning what we would possibly today call entrepreneurial attitudes that are deeply rooted in the population, where everyone thinks of themselves as a potential entrepreneur or share owner, where everyone works hard to improve themselves and so forth. And in a certain way, if you then look at the composition, for example, of Tory MPs who entered Parliament in the 1980s, these were very often people who came from not so privileged backgrounds and were people who had experienced social mobility and saw that as a product of their hard work and had chosen very individualist sort of paths of improving themselves. So in a certain way, this was part of this project, and it was also part of the popular appeal of this project.
Just going back for a moment to Stuart Hall and to Bob Jessop, in your book you make this distinction between class politics and economic order politics. Could you explain what the distinction you're trying to make is exactly by using those terms? Yeah,
and this distinction at first may seem a bit counterintuitive. What do I mean by this? Well, when I started doing research on this topic, I was thinking I'm interested in the issue of class and how class is negotiated at the political level and addressed at the political level. And what you quickly realized once you asked that question is a whole range of political interventions have class effects. You could argue almost any political intervention has class effects of sorts, which means that to simply talk about class politics is a bit problematic, because you automatically see that there are different ways in which certain political interventions affect class. And my idea then was to say, well, there are political interventions that address class relations directly, and then there are others that have pretty massive effects, but in a more indirect manner. So I came up with this distinction by saying, well, class politics I reserve for those interventions that affect class in a more direct manner, whereas economic order politics is maybe something that has to do with economic policy and the broad sort of economic strategy that is put in place, very much affects class, but more in an indirect manner. So this may sound pretty abstract. To make it clearer, if you bring in changes to trade union law that have direct effects on how people in workplaces can organize and how people can act collectively who are working class people, then that would be class politics. If we talk about monetary policy, say, this can be awfully important in terms of its class effects, but obviously political interventions are aimed directly at addressing monetary issues, exchange rates, interest rates, and so forth. So that would be economic order politics.
In relation to this, so in the book you describe the way in which we have quite an understandable tendency to map changes in society sharply onto changes of government. But you argue that while the Labour government that preceded Thatcher's election didn't engage in the kind of aggressive class politics that you describe elsewhere in the book, they did set in train some of the policies that constituted the economic order that the Thatcher government oversaw. So could you say something about the continuities and discontinuities between the Labour government of James Callaghan and of the first Thatcher government?
I mean, what is important to take into account here is that there was the 1970s was a situation characterized by deep economic crisis, which then also started to translate into a political crisis and possibly also an ideological crisis. And what happened in the mid-70s was that the Callaghan government made an agreement with the IMF simply because the pound was under massive pressure There was the assumption that Britain needed help in a situation of high and rising unemployment and high inflation in terms of getting the British economy back on track. And in that situation, the Labour government chose to impose certain monetarist measures, in particularly to cut back on state spending and allow unemployment to increase. And in this sense, it foreshadowed some of the measures that then were put in place later in the Thatcher government. So in this sense, you could argue that there were already strong changes in the mid-1970s before Thatcher was even elected in terms of assumptions about how the economy should be managed and how governments should try to induce growth. So more of an attempt to do so by restricting state spending, by curbing inflation, by stabilizing the currency, which were all motives that would then be important for Thatcherite economic order politics. What was different, though, and there are some quotes in the book around this that I found quite interesting. Dennis Healey, who was the chancellor at the time, the Labour chancellor, said he was an unbelieving monetarist in the sense that he felt that financial markets needed this intervention to calm things down, but he did not really believe that this would be conducive to sort of stabilize growth over the medium term. So it was more sort of a short-termist intervention, whereas the Thatcher government very, very clearly was of the opinion that interventions of this type were absolutely necessary and the right way to turn the British economy around.
And so for the Callaghan government, it's more a sort of tactical move they make rather than betraying any real sympathy for neoliberalism more generally. I mean, I wonder if that perhaps points to the way in which, and this maybe brings us on to the new Labour government, that it can be very easy to think of Labour in terms of betraying the interests of the working class and perhaps being, secretly on the side of capital. And, you see this kind of rhetoric around red Tories at the moment about opponents of Corbyn within the Labour Party. And perhaps what that sort of serves to obscure is the invidious position a Labour government is almost always in that that there's this kind of pressure to ensure a stable regime of accumulation.
Yeah, I think it's an important question that you raise here, and it's something I was thinking about today also when I was thinking about how this story resonates with the present day. And I guess a big part of the reason why the circle around Blair embarked on this new Labour project was really the depth of the defeat they experienced, and at the same time the difficulty they saw in reversing a lot of the changes that come about under the Thatcher government. So I would in the end say, well, they were very timid in terms of what they tried to do, especially after, being re-elected and being re-elected again. But their calculation was surely that they had to ensure economic stability along the lines laid out by the Thatcher and then the major governments, and through that then create some space for certain interventions that would improve certain things for less privileged groups in British society. As I said, I'm still doubtful whether this especially over the medium term, was a viable strategy. But I wouldn't think of it in terms of them consciously betraying the working class or something like that. In fact, if you look at the discussions in the Labour Party throughout the Thatcherite era, there were always roughly two positions. One was saying we need to fight this tooth and nail because it's really dangerous and it does real damage to the people we represent. And another position that said we need to accommodate to the new realities. People are in favor of some or a lot of the changes that the Thatcher governments have instituted. In certain ways, certain groups have also benefited materially from those changes. Our policies should more be geared towards saying we don't change everything or create a rupture with what the Thatcherites did, but modify it. In a certain way, I think this was a very problematic strategy because in a lot of the cases, at least when it came to labor relations, it meant that the answer was acquiescence, not militantly fighting back against the attacks on organized labor. And I can't think of very many examples where that paid off, in the sense that the industries were run down anyway, people lost their jobs anyway. So in that sense, I'm doubtful about this strategy. At the same time, obviously, in certain ways and at certain points, especially after Thatcher had been re-elected twice in 1987, there was a feeling, there has been a profound shift and it's difficult to reverse that shift. And what do we do now? Which is sort of an understandable way of thinking if you think of a situation like that.
I was recently bickering with John McTernan on Twitter, that former advisor to Tony Blair, about the question of whether New Labour should be seen as neoliberal or not. And the argument he was making was that, say what you like about New Labour, but it did increase spending on public services. It did make efforts to channel resources to poorer communities, at least after the second budget. Initially, they kept to the spending commitments of the previous major government. What would you say to that argument? And what do you think it is in particular that characterises New Labour as a neoliberal project and as a consolidation of Thatcherism?
Well, I think it was a neoliberal project because it did not in any way touch, and I mean that brings me back to this possibly somewhat opaque distinction between economic order politics and class politics. In terms of the general economic strategy, I would say that there was a great degree of continuity. And you already mentioned the first budget, which was completely along the lines of what the Tories had laid out. And also this general reliance on an accumulation strategy that was driven by finance. I don't see how New Labour at any point seriously was trying to reverse or change that. So in that sense, there's a really strong degree of continuity, and that's why I introduced this term of economic order policy also to map this continuity. At the same time, an argument that I'm making is that in the area of class politics, there is a change. And there is especially a change when it comes to welfare policies that are more expansive when it comes to the public sector and the expansion of the public sector. That's something that changes. But the important point here is this happens against the backdrop of leaving almost everything else intact. So the economic strategy is left intact, and what's also left intact is all the changes to trade union laws that very, very much curb the ability for organized labor to remain in place. So in that sense, there is a strong degree of continuity. And from the late 80s onwards, there's more and more discontent with, let's say, the social impact of Thatcherism in the sense of its effect on communities, its effect on social inequality, its effect on public services and so forth. That's the area that New Labour takes up and where it takes up the discontent, but it leaves intact just about anything else. Now, you can say, obviously, that still brought material changes to people's lives. If your public sector is expanded, if people can access better public services, obviously that makes a massive change. But the problem is also that through leaving intact the accumulation strategy and leaving intact this heavy reliance on finance, and also leaving intact the liberalization of consumer credit markets, which inflated demand by allowing people to go into debt, leaving intact the privatization of social housing, all of that, and people, getting access to mortgages and all of that fed it directly into the big crisis from 2007 onward. So it was not very sustainable what New Labour did. In fact, they contributed directly to creating this huge crisis. In that sense, yes, some people benefited from the public sector being expanded or during the New Labour era, but that proved to be problematic once this big crisis hit.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other, a podcast from Tribune Magazine. If you would like to hear the extended version of this interview, please consider supporting the show via Patreon. You can find the page at patreon.com/poltheoryother. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week.